Hi guys, welcome back. This is Linda's Mafia Romance audio stories. Today's story is about a rival family's bride who becomes her husband's obsession, then chooses his darkness over freedom.
The chapel had no windows because windows suggested hope, and hope had no place between Marchetti and Corsini blood. Vivian Marchetti stood at the altar in a dress she had not chosen, her fingers wrapped around a bouquet she had not wanted, her heartbeat slow and mechanical like a clock counting down to an execution she had agreed to attend. She was 24 years old, and she was being married not to a man but to a treaty, a fragile, bleeding thing stitched together with the corpses of two families' pride. The marble floor beneath her heels was cold enough to remind her that churches were built on stone, not faith, and the man waiting for her at the end of the aisle did not turn to look at her as she walked. He did not need to. Draven Corsini had already memorized the sound of her breathing from the security footage he had watched for 6 months before agreeing to this arrangement. Don Marchetti, her father, escorted her with a grip that was less paternal and more custodial. He had not asked if she wanted this. He had told her, 3 nights ago, in his study filled with cigar smoke and the ghost of her dead sister's photograph turned face down on the desk. "You will fix what your sister broke." Vivian had not reminded him that her sister had been murdered, not broken. She had only nodded, because nodding was cheaper than screaming, and screaming had never bought her anything except a locked door and a missed meal. Now she walked past rows of armed men in suits, Corsini on the left, Marchetti on the right, their hands never far from the hidden holsters beneath their jackets, and she felt less like a bride and more like a hostage who had been given better shoes. Draven Corsini finally turned when she stopped beside him. He was tall in a way that felt deliberate, as if he had grown past the point of comfort just to make other men smaller. His eyes were the color of old coins, not gold but the greenish-brown of wealth left too long in the dark. He did not smile. He looked at her the way a collector looks at a disputed painting, not certain if it was authentic, but certain he would own it by the end of the night. His voice, when he spoke the vows, was flat and precise, each word a small blade placed exactly where it would not kill but would remind her that it could. "I take you as my wife, not love, not honor, just take." Vivian repeated her own vows in a voice that did not shake, because she had learned at 14 that shaking gave men permission to push harder. She took him as her husband. She did not say for better or for worse because worse was already sitting in the front row wearing Donna Corsini's diamond choker and smiling with her teeth hidden. The priest, a nervous man with sweat on his upper lip who had been paid by both families to overlook the guns in the pews, pronounced them bound. Draven did not kiss her. He took the bouquet from her hands and handed it to a stone-faced bridesmaid who was actually a Corsini operative, and he said, "The car is waiting, not we, not us, the car," as if she were luggage being transferred from one territory to another. Vivian walked beside him down the aisle, and she felt every Marchetti eye on her back like a brand, and she felt every Corsini eye on her throat like a promise. Outside, the November wind cut through her dress, and she did not shiver because shivering would have been a confession. The penthouse was 50 floors above a city that did not care which family bled on which corner. Vivian had never seen it before. Draven had sent her a photograph 3 days ago, not the view, not the bedroom, but the lock on the front door. A biometric scanner, a keypad, and a deadbolt that required 2 separate physical keys. "So you understand," he had written in the message that accompanied the photograph, "that leaving is a negotiation, not a right." She had deleted the message but kept the photograph in her memory, because forgetting would have been stupidity, and stupidity had killed her sister long before any Corsini bullet had. The elevator ride was silent. Draven stood with his back to her, watching the floor numbers climb, and Vivian watched the reflection of his face in the polished brass doors. He was not looking at her reflection. He was looking at something behind her, something that did not exist, and she realized with a cold pull in her stomach that he was practicing the emptiness of his expression. He was rehearsing not to want her. That meant he already did, and the wanting was the dangerous part, because men like Draven Corsini did not know how to want anything gently. The penthouse opened into a living room that was all black marble and gray velvet, furniture arranged not for comfort but for sightlines, every seat facing every entrance, every mirror placed to eliminate blind spots. Vivian counted 3 cameras in the first 10 seconds. She knew because she had been taught to count cameras by her mother before her mother had been buried in an unmarked grave, and she knew because Draven had not bothered to hide them. He wanted her to see them. He wanted her to understand that her privacy was a performance he would allow only when it amused him. He poured himself a glass of whiskey from a decanter on a sideboard that also held a single photograph, a woman Vivian did not recognize, young and dark-haired and smiling in a way that suggested she had not yet learned to fear the man who kept her image. Vivian did not ask who she was. Asking would have been intimacy, and intimacy was a weapon she could not afford to hand him. Instead she stood in the center of the room, still wearing her wedding dress, and waited. Draven drank slowly. He did not offer her a glass. He set the whiskey down and walked toward her with the same unhurried stride he had used down the aisle, and when he stopped, he was close enough that she could smell the gun oil on his collar and the salt of his skin beneath it. He did not touch her. He reached past her and locked the front door, the deadbolt turning with a sound like a bone settling into place, and then he stepped back and looked at her as if she were a problem he had decided to solve in the most interesting way possible. "On your knees," he said. Vivian did not move. She had expected this, or something like it, some early test of her spine, some demand designed to measure how much she would take before she broke. But expectation and reality were different animals, and reality was his voice in a room with no windows and 3 cameras and a photograph of a dead woman whose smile might have been a warning. "No," she said. His expression did not change. That was worse than anger. Anger she could predict, could counter, could survive. Emptiness she could not read, and what she could not read she could not control. He tilted his head slightly, the way a predator does when prey does something unexpected but not unwelcome. "You swore vows," he said. To obey. To honor. To serve, I swore vows to a treaty, she said. Not to you. There is a difference, Draven. One of them is paper. The other is a man who hides cameras in his own home because he is afraid of what he cannot see. The silence that followed was not empty. It was packed tight with everything he did not say, with the brother she had supposedly killed, with the sister he had supposedly lost, with the 3 years of Cold War that had turned their families into graveyards wearing suits. Vivian held his gaze because looking away would have been the same as kneeling, and she had already given up her name, her home, her future. She would not give up her feet. Draven smiled. It was not a warm thing. It was slow and deliberate, the kind of smile that had no humor in it, only the quiet satisfaction of a man who had just found the weak spot he had been searching for. He stepped back, walked to the decanter, and poured a second glass. This one he held out to her. "You have teeth," he said. Good. I was worried they had sent me a lamb. Vivian did not take the glass. She watched him hold it, and she watched his thumb press against the crystal, and she understood that this was also a test, not of obedience, but of trust. He was offering her something she could drink or refuse or throw in his face. Each choice told him something different about the shape of her spine. She took the glass. She did not drink. She held it, matching his posture, and she said, "What do you actually want, Draven? Not from the treaty. From me, He walked around her slowly, and she did not turn to follow him because turning would have shown him her back, and showing her back to a Corsini was the first lesson her mother had taught her that she had never forgotten. He stopped behind her. She felt the heat of his body before she felt his breath on her neck, and then his voice came low and close to her ear, so quiet that the cameras could not have caught it. "I want you to hate me so completely," he said, "that when you finally stop, you will have nowhere else to put the love." She did not shiver. She did not close her eyes. She set the glass down on the nearest table, a black marble surface cold as a crypt, and she turned to face him, which meant stepping into his chest, which meant letting him see the anger she had stopped hiding. "You are not my first monster," she said. And you will not be my last. The only question is whether you are smart enough to be afraid of what I became before I walked into this room. Something shifted in his face. Not softness, Draven Corsini did not have softness anywhere in his architecture, but recognition. The same recognition she had felt when she had first seen his file, when she had read about the 16-year-old boy who had killed his own uncle with a letter opener and smiled for the mugshot. They were not enemies because their families hated each other. They were enemies because they were the same species of animal, and two predators did not share territory without blood. He reached up and touched her chin, not hard, not gentle, just there, a possession disguised as a gesture. "You will beg," he said. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. But before this year ends, you will get on your knees and beg me for something you cannot name, and I will give it to you, and you will hate yourself for needing it. That is not a threat, Vivian. That is a promise. She did not pull away from his hand. She let him hold her chin, and she let the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable, and then she said, "And if I make you beg first?" His hand dropped. Not in surprise, Draven did not do surprise, but in recalibration. He was rewriting his map of her in real time, moving landmarks, redrawing borders. She watched him do it, and she felt a small, vicious pleasure in the way his jaw tightened for only a fraction of a second. He stepped back and gestured toward a door at the end of a long hallway. Your room is the second on the left. The first is mine. Do not confuse them. She walked past him without looking back. She found the room, gray sheets, no windows, a single camera in the corner with a blinking red light she did not bother to cover, and she sat on the edge of the bed in her wedding dress and stared at the wall. She did not cry. She had stopped crying the night her sister had died, when she had promised the empty sky that she would never give another man the satisfaction of her tears. But her hands were shaking. Not from fear. From the thing she would not name, the thing that had flickered in Draven's eyes when he had said beg, not cruelty, not even desire, but recognition. He had looked at her and seen something she had tried to bury under years of obedience and silence and survival. He had looked at her and said, I know what you are. And the worst part, the part that would keep her awake until dawn, was that she had looked at him and thought the same thing. Outside her locked door, she heard him walk past. His footsteps paused at the threshold. She heard his breath through the wood, just once, just a sound so quiet she might have imagined it, and then he was gone. The deadbolt turned again, this time from the outside. She was not a wife. She was not a hostage. She was a seed planted in concrete, and Draven Corsini was waiting to see what kind of flower grew through the cracks. She lay down in her wedding dress and closed her eyes, and she dreamed of nothing. Nothing was safer. Nothing did not have his voice in it. But when she woke at 3 in the morning, gasping from a dream she could not remember, she found a glass of water on her nightstand that had not been there before. It was still cold. And the camera in the corner was no longer blinking. It was watching. She drank the water anyway. The first week was a tutorial in erosion. Draven did not starve Vivian. He did not strike her. He did not visit her room at night or force her to share his bed. Instead he gave her everything she had never been allowed to want, silk robes, hot baths at midnight, books with pages uncut and spines unbroken, and he took nothing in return except her presence at dinner. 3 hours each evening, facing each other across a table long enough to bury a body between them, and he asked her questions. Not about the treaty. Not about her father. About her. What frightened her. What she had loved as a child. The name of her first pet? The song she hummed when she thought no one was listening. She answered in monosyllables or silence, and he nodded as if she had given him poetry, and the next morning something new would appear in her room. A thunderstorm lamp that flickered without sound. A weighted blanket. A book of architecture from the city she had been born in and never allowed to leave. He was not courting her. He was cataloging her, and the cataloging was worse than cruelty because cruelty would have given her a clean wound. This was a slow bleeding she could not locate. Sarah came on the 8th day. The maid moved through the penthouse like a ghost in a gray uniform, her hands always full of linens or silver polish, her eyes always down. But when she passed Vivian in the hallway, she whispered, your father sends word. The knife is still in your sleeve. Vivian had no knife in her sleeve. She had hidden it 3 days ago in a hollowed-out book on mythology, and she had not told a single soul. She looked at Sarah, and Sarah looked back with the particular emptiness of someone who had been paid to betray and had decided to betray twice instead of once. Vivian said nothing. She walked past, and that night she moved the knife to the hem of her pillowcase, and she did not sleep until she heard Draven's breathing even out behind his own door. The chess set was his grandfather's. Vivian learned this when she broke it. He had left it in the library, onyx and alabaster, each piece carved into the shape of soldiers and kings and queens with swords instead of crowns, and she had picked up the black queen and felt the weight of it, and something in her chest had snapped. Not because of the chess set. Because of the thunderstorm lamp. Because of the book on architecture. Because he had learned that she used to play chess with her sister before the sister died, and he had put the board in her path like a trap baited with nostalgia. She threw the black queen at the wall. It shattered into 3 pieces. Then she swept her arm across the board and watched 31 remaining pieces scatter across the marble floor like teeth. She stood in the wreckage, breathing hard, and she did not hear him enter until he was already standing in the doorway. Draven looked at the broken pieces. He looked at her. He did not yell. He knelt down and began picking up the alabaster pieces one by one, placing them into his palm with a care that made her stomach turn. That was my father's, he said quietly. He taught me to play on this board. He died holding the white king. Vivian waited for the punishment. A slap. A lock on her door. A message sent to her father in the form of her own blood. Instead, Draven stood, crossed the room, and pressed the Black Queen's shattered head into her palm. "Fix it," he said. Asterisk or don't. But understand, every piece you break, I will remember. And I do not forget, asterisk. The poison was a mild sedative. Vivian had stolen it from Sarah's supply kit, a tiny vial of liquid that would not kill but would slow, would dull, would make a man's eyelids heavy and his tongue thick. She poured it into his whiskey on the 13th night, watching the amber liquid swallow the clear drops without a trace. She set the glass on his side of the dinner table. She sat down. She waited. He came in late, sleeves rolled to his elbows, a fresh bruise on his knuckles that she did not ask about. He picked up the whiskey. He looked at it. He looked at her. And then he drank it in one long swallow, his eyes never leaving her face, his throat working with the same deliberate slowness he used for everything. The sedative took 7 minutes. She counted. His eyelids drooped. His hand trembled around the empty glass. But he did not fall. He walked around the table, slowly, carefully, like a man navigating a room that had been tilted, and he stopped in front of her chair. He smelled of whiskey and iron and something green, like crushed rosemary. He braced one hand on the back of her chair and leaned down until his mouth was a breath from her ear. "You want me dead?" he murmured, and his voice was thick but not slurred, drugged but not defeated. "Earn it." Then he straightened, walked to the door, and collapsed against the frame. He did not fall. He caught himself. He turned and looked at her with eyes that were half closed but still sharp, still watching, still cataloging. "Until then," he said, "you're mine," and he left her sitting at the table with the empty glass and the poison bottle still hidden in her sleeve and the terrible knowledge that he had known. He had always known. He had drunk it anyway. The courtyard execution happened at dawn. Rafe dragged the traitor, a Corsini soldier named Petrov who had sold shipping routes to the Marchetti underboss, into the gravel, forced him to his knees, and stepped back. Draven stood with his hands in his pockets, his overcoat dark against the gray sky, his breath fogging in the cold. He called Vivian to his side. She came because running would have been seen and because refusing would have been recorded and because some part of her, the part she was learning to hate, wanted to see what he would do with her watching. He handed her a gun. A revolver, heavy and cold, the cylinder full. "He killed 3 of my men," Draven said, not looking at her. Asterisk, he sold your family the route that got your cousin killed last spring. He is not innocent. But he is also not the one holding the gun. Asterisk. Vivian looked at Petrov. The man was crying, silent, humiliated, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. She had never seen a Corsini soldier cry. She had never seen a man look so afraid and so angry at the same time. Draven's hand closed over hers on the grip of the revolver. "You wanted to poison me," he said quietly. Asterisk. This is cleaner. Pull the trigger, and you prove you belong here. Refuse, and I prove you don't. Asterisk. She did not pull the trigger. She held the gun, and she felt Draven's finger slide over hers, and he pulled it for her. The sound was flat and wet and over in a second. Petrov fell forward. The gravel drank the blood. Vivian's hand did not shake, but her teeth were clamped together so hard she tasted iron. Draven took the gun from her, wiped it with a handkerchief, and pressed it back into her palm. "Keep it," he said. "The next one, you do alone." Then he walked away, and Rafe began directing the cleanup, and Vivian stood in the courtyard with a dead man at her feet and a warm gun in her hand and the certain knowledge that she had not looked away. She had not closed her eyes. She had watched a man die because Draven had asked her to, and she had not stopped it, and the worst part was that she was not sure she had wanted to. That night she dreamed of his hands. Not hurting. Not holding. Just there, pressed flat against her shoulder blades, spanning her waist, cupping her jaw like she was something precious and something breakable all at once. She woke with her own hand pressed to her throat, feeling a phantom warmth that belonged to no one but the man who had made her watch a murder and then given her a gun and called it a gift. She lay in the dark, and the camera in the corner blinked red, and she did not cover it. She turned toward the wall and pressed her forehead against the cool plaster and whispered a word she had not spoken in 3 years. Why, not to him. To herself. Because she was beginning to understand that she was not his prisoner because he had locked the door. She was his prisoner because she had stopped trying the handle. In the morning, a new chess set sat on the library table. Onyx and alabaster. Soldiers and kings and queens with swords instead of crowns. And on the Black Queen's pedestal, a tiny drop of glue where a shattered head had been repaired. Vivian sat down. She picked up the White King. She set it on its square, and then she picked up the black queen and set it across from him, and she played the first move alone. Mira arrived on a Tuesday, which Vivian later decided was appropriate because Tuesdays had always been her least favorite day of the week, too far from the hope of Monday and too close to the rot of Wednesday. The former fiancé swept into the penthouse wearing diamonds that caught the light like tiny threats, her perfume announcing her presence 3 seconds before her voice did. She touched Draven's arm. She called him by a childhood nickname Vivian had never heard. She looked at Vivian the way one looks at a stain on a rented gown. The broodmare, Mira said to no one in particular, laughing. I hear they're hoping for a boy within the year. To seal the blood, you understand. Vivian said nothing. She had learned that silence was a weapon, and she sharpened it against her tongue. Draven dismissed Mira in front of everyone. Not politely. Not quietly. He removed her hand from his arm as if it were a spider, and he said, "My wife's thorns are sharper than your whole garden," and he walked away without waiting for a response. Myra's face did not crumble, she was too well bred for crumbling, but something behind her eyes went cold and still, the way water does before it freezes solid. Vivian felt a pulse of satisfaction so hot and so immediate that it burned her from the inside. Then she felt the shame follow, because she had no business wanting him to defend her, and no business enjoying the taste of another woman's humiliation, and no business feeling grateful to a man who kept her in a gilded cage with a blinking red camera for a son. Detective Callum came 3 days later. He arrived through the service entrance, which should have been impossible, which meant Draven had allowed it or Rafe had been paid or the world had simply decided to give Vivian one final chance to ruin herself. He was a thin man with a thin smile and eyes that had stopped being surprised by corruption years ago. He pressed a key into her palm, cold metal, warm from his pocket, and a burner phone with a single number programmed into it. "Tomorrow night," he whispered. Storm coming. "Your father sends his love." Vivian took both items. She hid the key in the hem of her dress and the phone inside the hollowed-out book where the knife used to live, and she did not ask herself why her father had waited 3 weeks to offer her an escape he could have arranged on her wedding night. The storm arrived on schedule. Thunder rolled across the city, and Vivian's chest tightened because thunder had always been her undoing. Her sister had died during a storm, the power out, the siren swallowed by the wind. Draven knew this. He had written it down somewhere, in the catalog he kept of her fears and her fractures. That night he left her door unlocked for the first time. She did not know if it was a test or a trap or a kindness twisted until it looked like cruelty. She did not wait to find out. She took the key, the phone, the knife from the pillowcase, and she walked through the service exit and into the rain. The alley was dark and slick with water. She ran. 3 blocks. Her lungs burned. The storm swallowed the sound of her footsteps, and she let herself believe, just for one breath, just for one heartbeat, that she had done it. That she was free. That the cage had opened and she had flown. Then the headlights came on. 3 cars, blocking the street in front and behind. Rafe stepped out of the first one, rain plastering his hair to his skull, his expression not angry but tired, as if he had known she would run and had only been waiting for the storm to make it interesting. "Mr. Corsini wants you back," he said. "Please don't make me carry you." She went without fighting. Not because she was afraid. Because she had run 3 blocks, and in those 3 blocks she had not once looked for a taxi or a police station or a phone booth. She had run toward the river, toward the bridge, toward the place where her sister had died. She had run home. And home was not freedom. Home was a different kind of cage with a different lock and the same view of the water. She sat in the back of the car with her hands folded in her lap, and she did not cry, but she wanted to, and wanting to was worse than doing it. Draven was waiting in his study. The fire was lit. The broken chess set had been repaired again. He stood by the window, watching the rain streak the glass, and he did not turn when Rafe announced her. He waited until Rafe left and the door closed and the lock engaged. Then he turned. His face was not angry. His face was the face of a man who had been given a gift and had it snatched away, not because it was stolen but because it had chosen to leave. That was worse than anger. Anger he could have spent. This was a quiet that would fester. He walked to his desk. He opened a drawer. He took out a photograph, the only photograph Vivian had of her sister, the one she had hidden in her coat lining, the one she had thought was still there. He held it over the flame of a candle on his desk. The edges curled. The faces began to brown. Vivian lunged, but he caught her wrist, not hard, just there, just enough to stop her. "This," he said, watching the photograph burn, "is what you lose if you try again." The flame ate her sister's smile. It ate the background, the park bench, the tree where they had carved their initials. Vivian watched it turn to ash, and something inside her turned with it. Not her anger. Not her hatred. Her resistance. The part of her that had believed she could leave without losing everything she had left to lose. She stopped fighting. Not because she was weak. Because she was tired in a way that went deeper than sleep, a bone tiredness that had been building since her sister died, since her father sold her, since she walked down an aisle toward a man who drank poison to prove he was not afraid of her. She looked at the ash on the desk, and she looked at Draven's hand still around her wrist, and she said, "Why me?" not as a challenge. As a question she actually wanted answered. He released her wrist. He took her face in both hands, gently, so gently it hurt more than a slap would have, and he said, "Because you are the only thing that has ever made me feel alive." Then he kissed her. It was not romantic. It was bruising and desperate and tasted like smoke and rain and the ghost of the whiskey she had tried to poison him with. His hands shook. She did not know if he was shaking from rage or want or the simple terror of having touched something he could not control. She did not kiss him back. But she did not pull away either. And when he finally stepped back, breathing hard, she saw that his eyes were wet. Not crying. Just wet. As if the storm had gotten inside him too. "You will never leave again," he said. It was not a question. Vivian wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. She looked at the ash on the desk. She looked at the camera in the corner. She looked at the man who had burned her last memory of her sister and called it love. "No," she said. "I won't." She did not say because she could not. She did not say because she had nowhere to go. She said it because she was no longer sure she wanted to leave, and that uncertainty was more frightening than any lock or key or threat he had ever made. She sat down in the chair across from his desk, and she picked up the Black Queen from the repaired chess set, and she held it in her palm, and she felt the tiny seam where the shattered head had been glued back together. She understood then that she was the Black Queen. Broken. Repaired. And still on the board. Draven sat down across from her. He did not speak. He picked up the White King, and he set it on its square, and he waited. Outside, the storm began to fade. Vivian made her first move. Not because he had asked her to. Because she had nowhere else to put her hands. Lucian came to her in a dream, but the dream was real. He slipped into the penthouse through a service door that should have been guarded, and he stood at the foot of her bed at 2 in the morning, and he put a finger to his lips before she could scream. He was 22 and looked 17 in the dark, still the boy she had taught to tie his shoes, still the brother who had hidden under the bed with her when their father drank too much. But his eyes were older. His eyes had been sharpened by 3 years of watching his sister marry a murderer. The anniversary ball, he whispered. Poison in his glass. "I have the compound. You just have to pour." Vivian looked at the camera in the corner. The red light was off. Lucian had killed the feed. She looked at her brother's face, and she saw their dead sister's jawline, their mother's cheekbones, their father's capacity for betrayal. She said yes. She said it because saying no would have meant explaining why, and she did not have words for the thing growing in her chest that felt like hatred and tasted like need. The compound came in a glass vial no larger than her thumb. Lucian pressed it into her palm, kissed her forehead, and left the way he had come. Vivian sat on the edge of her bed with the vial hidden in her fist, and she did not sleep. She thought about Draven's hands on her face. She thought about the photograph burning. She thought about the way he had drunk the poison she had already given him, not because he was stupid but because he had wanted her to see that he trusted her to fail. She thought about how much she wanted to prove him wrong. She did not know if she wanted to prove him wrong by killing him or by not killing him. That was the terror. That was the fracture. The anniversary ball was held in the great hall of the Corsini estate, a room that had been built to host kings and had since hosted only funerals and forced celebrations. Vivian wore a black dress that Draven had chosen, silk, sleeveless, with a neckline that dropped to her sternum and a slit that rose to her thigh. She was a weapon dressed as a woman. He met her at the top of the stairs, and for a moment he simply looked at her, and his face did something it had never done before. It softened. Not much. Just enough. "You are beautiful," he said, and the words cost him something. She could see it in the tightness around his mouth. "I hate that everyone will see you." She said nothing. The vial was taped to the inside of her thigh. She could feel it against her skin, warm now, patient. The toast came at midnight. Draven stood at the head of the table, 300 guests watching, a glass of champagne in his hand. Vivian stood beside him with her own glass. The vial was open. The compound was clear and odorless, and it was already in her palm, and all she had to do was tip it into his champagne when he turned to acknowledge the applause. He turned. She reached. And then he caught her wrist. Not hard. Not angry. Just there, the way he had caught her when the photograph was burning. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. And then he took the vial from her fingers without anyone seeing, and he slipped it into his own pocket, and he raised his glass to the crowd and drank his champagne like a man who had never been afraid of anything. "My study," he said beneath the noise. "Now." She followed him because running was no longer an option. She remembered how to choose. The study was empty. The fire was cold. Draven closed the door and leaned against it, and he did not look at her for a long moment. When he finally did, his face was not the face of a man who had caught an assassin. It was the face of a man who had been given a reprieve he did not deserve. "My brother," he said. Asterisk, "I killed him." "Not you." Asterisk. Vivian went still. The words did not make sense, so she did not try to make them make sense. She waited. He told her everything. How his older brother had taken Vivian's sister to the warehouse by the river. How he had tortured her for 3 days, not for information but for pleasure. How Draven had found her body. How he had walked into his brother's bedroom that same night and put a bullet into his skull while he slept. "I was 16, he said. Asterisk, "Your family blamed me because they needed someone to blame. I let them. It was easier than telling you that your sister died because of a Corsini, and I was the only Corsini who tried to stop it." Asterisk. He stepped toward her. Asterisk. "I have loved you since I saw you weep at her grave. You were 14. You did not see me. I was in a car across the street, and you were on your knees in the rain, and I have never been the same." Asterisk. Vivian dropped the vial. It rolled under the desk and stopped against the wall. She did not pick it up. She looked at this man who had burned her photograph, who had locked her in a penthouse, who had made her watch an execution and then handed her the gun. She looked at him, and she saw a boy of 16 with blood on his hands and no one to tell. She saw herself at 14, kneeling in the rain, praying to a God who had not answered. They were the same. They had always been the same. 2 children shaped by the same violence, standing on opposite sides of a war neither of them had started. "You should have told me," she whispered. "You would not have believed me," he said. She believed him now. That was the worst part. They did not speak after that. He walked her to her room, and he did not lock the door, and he lay down on the bed beside her, not touching, just present, just there. She turned her back to him. He pressed his chest to her spine. His arm came around her waist, heavy and warm, an iron bar disguised as an embrace. She did not push him away. She did not lean into him. She lay in the space between, and she felt his heartbeat against her shoulder blades, and she counted each one like a small death. At dawn, Lucian attacked. The explosion came from the east wing. Then gunfire. Then screaming. Vivian was out of bed before she opened her eyes, her hand finding the knife still hidden in the pillowcase, her bare feet silent on the marble floor. Draven was behind her, already armed, already pushing her toward the service stairs. "Go," he said. Asterisk. The garage. Rafe will. Asterisk. A bullet took him in the shoulder. Not the heart. Not the head. The shoulder, spinning him around, dropping him to one knee. Vivian saw the shooter. One of Lucian's men, young and scared, his hands shaking around the grip of a rifle. She did not think. She crossed the room, grabbed the rifle barrel, twisted it out of the man's hands, and drove her knife into his throat. He fell. She stepped over him. She dragged Draven to his feet, and she pulled him down the service stairs, and she did not stop until they were in the garage, until the door was closed, until the sounds of the attack were muffled behind concrete and steel. Lucian found them there. He came through the maintenance entrance, a pistol in his hand, his face splattered with someone else's blood. "Step aside, Vivian," he said. "He dies today." She stood in front of Draven. She did not step aside. "You will have to kill me first," she said. Lucian laughed. Then he saw her face, and he stopped laughing. He saw that she meant it. He saw that the sister he had come to save had already been claimed by the enemy, not through force but through something worse. Through understanding. Through shared wounds. Through the terrible alchemy of 2 broken people pressing their fractures together until they fit. "You're choosing him," Lucian said. "Not a question." "I'm choosing not to be alone," she said. Lucian lowered the gun. He looked at Draven, bleeding, kneeling, one hand pressed to his shoulder, and he looked at Vivian with her bare feet and her blood-stained hands and her eyes that had stopped being his years ago. He left. The maintenance door swung shut behind him. The garage fell silent. Vivian turned to Draven. He was pale, losing blood, his breathing shallow. She tore a strip from her silk dress and pressed it to his wound, and he hissed through his teeth but did not pull away. "If I live," he said, his voice thin, "I will never let you go." She pressed harder. The silk turned black. "Then live," she said. "Because I am not done hating you yet." She did not say the other thing. The thing that had been growing in her chest since the night he drank the poison, since the morning he held the gun with her, since the moment he told her the truth about her sister. She did not say that she had stopped hating him weeks ago. She did not say that what she felt now was worse than hatred. It was recognition. It was need. It was the quiet, terrible knowledge that she would kill for him again. She had just done it. And she would do it 100 times more, not because he had asked her to, but because protecting him had felt exactly like protecting herself. The ambulance came. The attackers fled. The sun rose over a house that had nearly burned to the ground. Vivian rode in the back of the ambulance with Draven's head in her lap, and she did not cry, but she held his hand, and she did not let go even when the paramedic asked her to step aside. She watched the city pass through the small window, and she thought about her sister's grave, and she thought about the rain, and she thought about a boy of 16 with blood on his hands and nowhere to put his grief. She thought about the vial under the desk, still full of poison, still waiting. She would not use it. She would never use it. That was not mercy. It was something else entirely. Something she did not have a name for yet. 3 months passed like a single breath held too long. Draven survived the bullet, but his left leg dragged now, a limp that turned his stride into something slower and more deliberate, as if even his body had learned to calculate every movement. Vivian did not ask if he resented her for it. She already knew the answer. He did not resent her. He wore the scar on his shoulder like a wedding band, and he touched it when he thought she was not looking, and he smiled a private smile that made her chest ache in a way she refused to name. She ran the household now. The Corsini estate had been rebuilt. New walls where the explosion had torn through, new locks on every door, new cameras with lenses she had learned to ignore. The maids reported to her. The guards answered to her. Rafe brought her the morning reports instead of Draven, because Draven had decided that trust was not a thing you gave but a thing you surrendered, and he had surrendered his empire to her one file at a time. She signed documents. She ordered executions. She sat at the head of the table when he was too tired to rise from bed, and she spoke with his voice, and the men who heard her learned to flinch at her silences the way they had once flinched at his. The knife still lived under her pillow. The cameras still blinked red from every corner. But now she used the knife to cut his apples into thin slices when he was too weak to hold the blade steady, and she looked at the cameras and did not cover them because she had stopped wanting privacy she had never truly owned. He watched her. She knew he watched her. And she watched him back, not with hatred anymore but with a focus so intense it had become its own kind of obsession. She knew the sound of his breathing in sleep. She knew the way his fingers tapped against his thigh when he was lying. She knew that he said her name in his dreams, not in fear but in wonder, as if he still could not believe she had stayed. Lucian came again on a Tuesday, because Tuesdays had become the day for ruin. He did not come with guns this time. He came with a bomb wired into the engine of Draven's car, a silent thing, patient, waiting for the turn of the key. Vivian found it before Draven did. She had developed a habit of checking the undercarriage of every vehicle she entered, because paranoia was not a sickness in her world but a survival skill. She saw the wires. She saw the timer. She did not call for help. She slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove toward the river before the bomb could kill anyone except her. Draven was in the passenger seat. He had followed her because he always followed her now, unable to let her walk any room alone, unable to trust that she would still be there when he turned around. He saw her face. He saw her hands on the wheel. He saw the river approaching at 50 miles an hour, and he did not ask why. He reached across the console and took her hand, and he held it, and he did not let go even when the car left the road and the world turned to glass and water and the dark cold of the river closing over their heads. The water was black and silent. Vivian unbuckled her seatbelt. She pulled Draven through the driver's side window, her lungs burning, her ears ringing with the pressure, her arms screaming around his chest. He was heavier than she remembered, dead weight in the current, but he was not dead yet. She could feel his heartbeat against her ribs. She kicked for the surface. The light was far away, a gray promise through the murk, and she kicked and she pulled and she refused to let the river have him because she had not saved him from her brother just to lose him to water. They broke the surface together. She dragged him to the shore. He coughed the river out of his lungs, and she lay beside him in the mud, and she did not cry, but she pressed her forehead to his and breathed the same wet air and felt the same shaking relief that meant they had both survived something they should not have survived. He signed against her palm. I love you. He had learned the gestures for her, in secret, because words had never been enough for either of them. She signed back, her fingers clumsy with cold. I know, not I love you too, not yet. But close. Close enough that he smiled, and the smile was not cold or calculating or sharp. It was just tired. Just grateful. Just human. They burned Lucian's faction that night. Vivian did not ask Draven's permission. She took Rafe and 7 men, and she went to the warehouse where her brother had been hiding, and she gave him 1 hour to leave the city forever. He refused. She set the fire herself, standing at the edge of the flames, watching the building collapse inward like a lung emptying of air. Lucian escaped through a basement tunnel. She had known he would, had left it open on purpose, but his men did not. His supplies did not. His war did not. She walked away from the burning warehouse and did not look back, because looking back had never saved anyone she loved. The final scene was not a scene she would have imagined 3 months ago, or 6, or the night she had knelt at her sister's grave and promised never to love again. Vivian sat on Draven's throne, black wood, worn armrests, a seat that had been warmed by generations of Corsini cruelty. She wore black trousers and a gray sweater, no diamonds, no silk, no armor made of fabric. Her hair was wet from the river. Her hands were raw from the fire. And she had her hand around Draven's throat. Not choking. Just holding. Her fingers pressed to his pulse, feeling it beat against her palm, feeling the life she had saved and the life she had taken and the life they had built together out of blood and ash and stubborn, broken want. He knelt before her. Not because she had asked. Because kneeling was the only way he knew how to look up at something he worshipped. His limp leg was stretched to the side. His scarred shoulder was bare beneath his torn shirt. His eyes were the color of old coins, and they were full of her. You will never leave, he said. It was not a question. It had not been a question for a long time. Vivian tightened her fingers against his throat. Not enough to hurt. Just enough to feel the shape of him beneath her hand, the vulnerability he showed no one else, the trust he had given her the way a man gives a knife to an enemy and turns his back. I stopped wanting to, she said. He smiled. It was the same smile he had worn in the courtyard, the same smile he had worn when she poisoned his whiskey, the same smile he had worn when he burned her sister's photograph. But now it was different. Now it was hers. Now it meant something other than cruelty. It meant surrender. It meant devotion. It meant that he had looked into the dark heart of what he was and found her there, waiting, and he had decided that the dark was not something to escape but something to share. She released his throat. He rose slowly, favoring his leg, and he did not sit on the throne beside her. He stood behind her, and he placed his hands on her shoulders, and he rested his chin on the top of her head, and they watched the dawn break over a city that now belonged to both of them. The sun rose gray and cold through the windows of the penthouse that had once been her cage. The cameras blinked red. The knife was still under her pillow. The chess set sat on the library table, waiting for a game that never ended. Vivian closed her eyes. She felt his heartbeat through his palms. She felt her own heartbeat rise to meet it. They were two damaged things that had found each other in the dark, and they had not healed each other. That was not what this was. They had simply decided to bleed together instead of alone. Until death, she said quietly. And not even then, he answered. Was not a sickness in her world but a survival skill. She saw the wires. She saw the timer. She did not call for help. She slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove toward the river before the bomb could kill anyone except her. Draven was in the passenger seat. He had followed her because he always followed her now, unable to let her walk any room alone, unable to trust that she would still be there when he turned around. He saw her face. He saw her hands on the wheel. He saw the river approaching at 50 miles an hour, and he did not ask why. He reached across the console and took her hand, and he held it, and he did not let go even when the car left the road and the world turned to glass and water and the dark cold of the river closing over their heads. The water was black and silent. Vivian unbuckled her seatbelt. She pulled Draven through the driver's side window, her lungs burning, her ears ringing with the pressure, her arms screaming around his chest. He was heavier than she remembered, dead weight in the current, but he was not dead yet. She could feel his heartbeat against her ribs. She kicked for the surface. The light was far away, a gray promise through the murk, and she kicked and she pulled and she refused to let the river have him because she had not saved him from her brother just to lose him to water. They broke the surface together. She dragged him to the shore. He coughed the river out of his lungs, and she lay beside him in the mud, and she did not cry, but she pressed her forehead to his and breathed the same wet air and felt the same shaking relief that meant they had both survived something they should not have survived. He signed against her palm. I love you. He had learned the gestures for her, in secret, because words had never been enough for either of them. She signed back, her fingers clumsy with cold. I know, not I love you too, not yet. But close. Close enough that he smiled, and the smile was not cold or calculating or sharp. It was just tired. Just grateful. Just human. They burned Lucian's faction that night. Vivian did not ask Draven's permission. She took Rafe and 7 men, and she went to the warehouse where her brother had been hiding, and she gave him 1 hour to leave the city forever. He refused. She set the fire herself, standing at the edge of the flames, watching the building collapse inward like a lung emptying of air. Lucian escaped through a basement tunnel. She had known he would, had left it open on purpose, but his men did not. His supplies did not. His war did not. She walked away from the burning warehouse and did not look back, because looking back had never saved anyone she loved. The final scene was not a scene she would have imagined 3 months ago, or 6, or the night she had knelt at her sister's grave and promised never to love again. Vivian sat on Draven's throne, black wood, worn armrests, a seat that had been warmed by generations of Corsini cruelty. She wore black trousers and a gray sweater, no diamonds, no silk, no armor made of fabric. Her hair was wet from the river. Her hands were raw from the fire. And she had her hand around Draven's throat. Not choking. Just holding. Her fingers pressed to his pulse, feeling it beat against her palm, feeling the life she had saved and the life she had taken and the life they had built together out of blood and ash and stubborn, broken want. He knelt before her. Not because she had asked. Because kneeling was the only way he knew how to look up at something he worshipped. His limp leg was stretched to the side. His scarred shoulder was bare beneath his torn shirt. His eyes were the color of old coins, and they were full of her. You will never leave, he said. It was not a question. It had not been a question for a long time. Vivian tightened her fingers against his throat. Not enough to hurt. Just enough to feel the shape of him beneath her hand, the vulnerability he showed no one else, the trust he had given her the way a man gives a knife to an enemy and turns his back. I stopped wanting to, she said. He smiled. It was the same smile he had worn in the courtyard, the same smile he had worn when she poisoned his whiskey, the same smile he had worn when he burned her sister's photograph. But now it was different. Now it was hers. Now it meant something other than cruelty. It meant surrender. It meant devotion. It meant that he had looked into the dark heart of what he was and found her there, waiting, and he had decided that the dark was not something to escape but something to share. She released his throat. He rose slowly, favoring his leg, and he did not sit on the throne beside her. He stood behind her, and he placed his hands on her shoulders, and he rested his chin on the top of her head, and they watched the dawn break over a city that now belonged to both of them. The sun rose gray and cold through the windows of the penthouse that had once been her cage. The cameras blinked red. The knife was still under her pillow. The chess set sat on the library table, waiting for a game that never ended. Vivian closed her eyes. She felt his heartbeat through his palms. She felt her own heartbeat rise to meet it. They were two damaged things that had found each other in the dark, and they had not healed each other. That was not what this was. They had simply decided to bleed together instead of alone. Until death, she said quietly. And not even then, he answered. She opened her eyes. The sun was higher now. The city was waking up. And Vivian Marchetti Corsini sat on a throne of blood and bone, with a monster's hands on her shoulders and a monster's heart in her chest, and she smiled. It was not a nice smile. It was not meant to be.
That's the end of the story. I hope you loved and enjoyed it. Please like, share, subscribe to my channel, and don't forget to turn on your notification button to get more stories. And as always, stay dangerous.